Whenever you're ready.
I will call a meeting to order, and the first action is, can I get an approval of the agenda for tonight?
Make a motion to.
Can I get a second?
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
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 Opposed, say nay. Abstentions, motion carries. Does anyone have any comment on the approval for the minutes of last meeting, November 28th, 2023? Any comments on the minutes?
Move for approval.
Can I get a second?
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
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 Opposed, say nay. Abstentions, motion carries. Do you have any public comment, Lori?
We do not.
Okay, Lori, I'll turn it over to you for a project update.
Great. Thank you, Chair Kessie. All right. Well, good evening. Thank you all for being here tonight. I'll just provide a brief overview of the project and then turn it over to Beth Goodman, who's here from Echo Northwest. So the 50-year plan started out as a council goal in the 2021-2022 fiscal year. It's very land use focused, and it's to determine where the city will grow in the future and to ensure that we have the land that we need to support housing, employment, and other land needs for the 20 and 50-year horizons. So the main outputs, just as a reminder of this plan, are a 50-year vision statement to inform the plan, an updating housing capacity analysis and economic opportunities analysis. We also have with it updates to the comprehensive plan, the development code, and lastly, a UGB expansion to meet the 20-year land need and urban reserves to meet the 50-year land need. So in terms of this committee, we've completed the first 5 items, and now we're in those final stages of the UGB expansion and urban reserves analysis. After tonight, we'll have one more meeting with this committee, and we do not have a date set, although I'm thinking that might be after July 1st. After July 1st, just being mindful of the budget and what we have allocated still on the back end to do. And then the last meeting will be focused primarily on presenting the final areas we'll be proposing for the UGB expansion and urban reserves, and then a review likely of the final draft of the 50-year plan document. That document itself is just really meant to summarize everything we've done as a result of this project. All right, Beth.
Okay, great. This is working. So I'm going to go and do a little presentation here, and give me one moment while I get my screen shared. It doesn't want to share quite quickly. Here we go, share. That. Won't do that. Pardon me, I'm just having a little technical difficulty. NJ, would you like to come up and? It was fine for a few moments. The PC, I only do Mac.
Can I ask Lori a question while they're figuring out this technical? Hey, I was curious, the recent housing bill that passed that added lands, does this impact us at all in any way, shape, or form?
You mean in regards to the one-time UGB expansion
Yeah.
process? So we're not eligible for that. So
Okay, I was wondering. I saw they had a lot of if, ands, or buts.
Yeah, yeah. We
Okay,
did.
So we're not in the if and.
No, no.
Okay, I was wondering.
Yeah, thanks for asking.
I blame it for being a PC. We did look very closely to make sure whether Scaphoos was qualified for that. So made sure that we knew what was going on there before we continued with this.
The slideshow tab.
Okay. Ah, the slideshow tab. You would think that I never used PowerPoint, but I just don't use PCs anymore. I apologize. All right, so here we are this evening to talk about the 50-year plan and the urban reserves. And Jay, can you come and move this window out of my way?
Red one?
Leave that.
Thank you. I apologize. And to present some of the project progress at this point, and then really to discuss the areas for inclusion in the UGB and the urban reserves. We've got a few early pieces about that. Decisions haven't been made. We'll be working with Laurie and with city staff to identify very specific areas of some of these sub areas that would be appropriate to bring into the UGB and or in urban reserves. So we'll talk about that some. And then we'll be having a discussion with that about that with your city council and planning commission in the future also. Because while we're doing the work for you, we are not the decision makers. Okay, starting with the review of the land need. So here what we've shown you is the deficit for the 20-year period. In this column, we've got a 59-acre deficit. And the only place that you have a extra land is in low density. Looking at the 2043 to 73 period, you've got a 360-acre deficit for different land use types. So over the whole period for the 50 years, 419 acres, we're looking at these in two distinct types of deficits. One of them, the 59 acres, would be for an urban growth boundary expansion. For the specific land types that we're looking at here, employment and housing and public land designation. And then the 2043 to 73, that 360 acres would be for urban reserves, of which we don't designate what kind of land. We don't do plan designations on that land essentially at this point. We just designated urban reserves. And when the city needs a UGB expansion next time, you'll have areas to choose from. So that 360 acres, it's just urban reserve. So as we've talked about before, though, when you do an urban growth boundary expansion, you're required by the state to first look around the urban growth boundary for a half mile for all lands, and then a mile for all exceptions lands. So here, exceptions areas, which are areas that are currently in county zoning, those are shown in the cream color, and the gray color is resource land. So that's high quality farm and forest land. So according to the ORS, first priority is for urban reserves. Scappoose does not yet have urban reserves. So you've got no land in that priority. The second priority is for exceptions land and non-resource land. You've only got exceptions land around Scappoose. So you've got all these exceptions areas, which we've considered all of them within a half mile. And as we'll talk about it, there's a lot of land, enough land in those areas to meet the identified needs. So we don't get to third priority marginal land or farm or forest land that's not predominantly high value, and we don't get to the high value farm and forest land. Yes, sir.
I have a question, and this is going to be a big jump. I'm going to throw it out there. It seems very confining in what we can do.
Mm-hmm.
And laws may change down the road, hopefully making it easier to include land that may be more appropriate, even though it doesn't have the current exception zoning. Fine with all of the 20-year land when we need that, obviously, per law. 50-year land, brought an idea that maybe we don't use our full acreage allocation. And the reason why I'm suggesting that is surely feel like fools if 10 years from now or 5 years from now, state changed some of the land use laws, made it easier to select, pick and choose which lots we wanted to put into our long-term plan. If we put all that land in there, doesn't that kind of tie our hands?
Well, Brian, I'm
saying is once we put it in the 50-year plan, we can't really take it out, can we?
well, I mean, you may be able to remove land from urban reserves at that point. This has been an issue for decades, this priority scheme. And I do see many things changing in Oregon's land use system. But this is a point that I
You don't think that's gonna
I
happen?
don't think is going to change unless Oregon's land use system undergoes a vast change. This is, especially since a lot of your land that's around Scappoose is the highest value farmland. I don't
I just
honestly
don't
think
see
it's
that,
going to
'cause
change.
I was just thinking, we asked everybody here 30 years ago what we should be setting land up for. We'd be talking about candle factories, poly farm wreath factories, and all sorts of stuff that that right now obviously is not here and it's not going to be here. And I think it's good to have some exceptional lands because it would streamline the process in the future. I'm just wondering if we want to put pretty much all of our nuts in that basket. Not saying that we don't have that acreage.
Mhm.
Can we put that acreage without actually assigning it?
You don't
Some
assign
of
it.
No, I want to assign some of it because some of it's no brainer, right? So it's going to streamline it for future purposes. But I'm saying if we don't assign all of it, if we keep some of it back, then maybe we get lucky, or maybe priorities change, or maybe we can be more flexible in the future. And you may be right.
You're saying, Brian, take 100 acres. There's item.
That's correct. And
So
that-
you don't assign any of the acreage in the urban reserve.
We're not assigning a use, but we're assigning
Property.
quantity.
So you could say instead of a 50-year land supply, you could decide you're looking at a 30-year land supply, which would be roughly, it wouldn't exactly be, but roughly 120 acres. You could say that you're looking at a 40-year land supply or a 42-year land supply. So you don't have to do that whole 360 acres, but that is what we've been directed to do by city council.
I guess what but I'm also thinking that council may not fully understand ramifications of this at this point. I'm thinking just talking out, and this is a big idea to throw in this late in the game, but I've been mulling on this for a while. It may be farmland that's fairly close to our city limits that would not make this cut. But that maybe somehow, some way in the future it would. I would think we'd make it harder to get it in there if it's not in the urban reserves, but we can't put it in urban reserves now. So are we kind of tying our hands for the future generations? Meaning, should our kids be stuck with some of this? And I'm not saying that we don't need a 50-year or 40-year plan or something.
Sure.
I'm just saying, like when we did last time we did the 20-year plan, we did not assign everything. And then we ended up pulling in some additional acreage afterwards that wasn't in that plan. And
I would say though, too, number one, you can change, I guess, what areas are considered urban reserves.
There's
So
no-
if there were some change in the future that occurred in the land use laws for the state, you could make a change to what's designated as urban reserves at that time. Additionally, the further you get in the future, the greater land need you're going to have. So you could potentially pull in additional areas at that time. I don't think this is we're overseeing something. We're not, being proactive about it. I don't see an issue with that.
The other thing to consider is the types of land that you might want to bring in for industrial, for instance, have different characteristics than the types of land that we'll be bringing in an urban reserve. So I put this map back up here so that you can see, even without constraints set over this, we're talking about mostly smaller parcels of land. So if in the future the city were to need a new industrial use that required larger pieces of land, like parcels that were closer to 25 acres or 50 acres, assembling a 50-acre parcel out of these small pieces of land, many of which are very constrained, would be difficult. So you could make a different argument about needing a UGB expansion.
Now, there's no recourse, like if we were to take something that was in the UGB and try to take it out, that the owners would have potential recourse.
You could do that actually, if
Oh, you
it's
could-
not in the city limits.
It's not, so once it's in the city limits,
It's much harder.
So if it's in the urban reserve, there's no financial consequence for the city to remove it?
You haven't rezoned it.
Okay.
So
Correct,
So
yeah.
so there's no. Do you have any thoughts or you?
guess my question is that Brian's asking too is if we do with the urban reserves per your document here, but there's a piece of land that's constrained and it's not part of the urban reserves or part of the UG.
Just speak into the microphone, sorry.
And the landowner wants to bring it in to the UGB. Is it a lot harder to bring it in because it's not part of the urban reserves?
Well, unless it was for something like a specific industrial use where you had specific types of site characteristics that couldn't be found in your urban reserve area. So in other words, if you needed larger parcels of land, and you need a 25-acre piece of land, any of these urban reserve areas we're looking at, none of the ones that are under serious consideration have land of that size in it. And so you'd have to make a whole different type of UGB expansion case. And it's different than anything we've done here because we haven't been trying to make that case here, in part because Scappoose has so much industrial land in it. You can't really make that case around housing in the same way. So that's a difficulty, and you don't see commercial land needs of that kind of size very often. So that's a special sort of UGB argument.
Even that situation, we have several large parcels out at the airport right now, and we've had those there now. I mean, they've been available in theory, for a few years, and we haven't moved any of them. So I don't really see that happening. I mean, it might happen in year 45, but it's not going to happen in the next few years or anything like that.
I mean, the need for additional really large tracts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that I'm more concerned that not that we don't have a piece for a large tract. I don't see that as the immediate issue. Year 22, I'm seeing it more as an issue of you want to put a housing subdivision in. It's not in the UGB. It's not in the urban reserves, whatever reason. And maybe the rules have changed a little and we can get it in for whatever reason, but we can't. But now it makes it more arduous to get it in.
Well,
Because it's not in that package. And so, because now we got it, no, we have to get it in. We have to take something out. So then we have to go through the process of taking it out, explain to people why this piece should not be in, this piece should.
Brian, there's so much more land that could be brought in that we're not talking about bringing in exceptions area it's
still not going to be
a
The
problem.
reason why we're choosing certain areas and not others also is because, for instance, there may be roads stubbed already to the edge. There may be utilities. So thinking about that in terms of how easy it is to serve the property, we're looking at the best ones here. So it's not like you'd say, oh, well, this land over here is better
And that's one of the reasons.
until this has already been
Okay.
developed.
So you guys feel strongly that it's better just to go for the full.
I think it's going to serve the city in the longer term. Yeah. There was somebody I think online who may have wanted to make a comment.
Christine?
Oh, okay.
I had no comment.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, I'm going to continue on. So looking at the constraints, this is just a reminder of this. Scappoose is surrounded by constraints, a lot of floodplain, some slopes greater than 25%, and a lot of land slide hazards. And those are on farmland as well as on the areas around that are in exception zoning. So the difference between this map and what we've showed you before is we took off one of the constraints. We took off the wetlands constraint because we realized that we hadn't used that. That doesn't apply in the same way for housing land as it does for economic development land. And what that resulted in is adding areas 22 and 23 up here, which are currently in a gravel pit. And there's standing water there. We understand that that's eventually going to be filled in. That's an area that we knew as we evaluated it, given where it was and how it would connect with the city, that it's not going to evaluate in a very positive way at this point. It's, just north of the airport. it would be connected to the city by what's called a cherry stem. It would be very expensive to serve. So we simply decided to throw it into the evaluation pool with all the other areas, and simply do that evaluation. So within a half mile of the existing urban growth boundary, there's about 1,500 total acres of exceptions area, and 1,028 of them are unconstrained. And that's all the areas that are in one of these red boxes, essentially. There's other land that's in exceptions areas that we haven't evaluated, but it's very highly constrained areas. So like this area right next to Area 15, there's hardly any unconstrained land in there. This area between 15, 13, and 14. So we left those out of study areas because there's so little land in them that's unconstrained. So that's where we started. We've got our 23 sub areas. And as we're going through and evaluating each of those 23 study areas, we're looking at what are called the Goal 14 locational factors. So simply put, those are, can the area that we're looking at efficiently meet the city needs? Is the land developable, and does it connect well with existing neighborhoods? How does it fit into Scapoose's urban form? So like the area to the north, 22, 23, and Area 3, those have a poor fit with Scapoose's urban form. They would create a cherry stem. The second locational factor is, can public services, so infrastructure and utilities, be expanded to the area in a cost-effective and logical way? So we've looked at transportation, municipal water, and sewer service to evaluate those. And we've had a lot of help from your public works department on doing that. We're not trying to put dollar numbers to each of these sub areas because that would be very expensive to do, doing the engineering work to figure out how much it would cost to get all of that infrastructure. So we've looked at it as a high, medium, low sort of evaluation. And then a qualitative an evaluation of what impacts would development have on the environment, on the local community, local economy and community life. And then what impacts would development have on nearby farm and forest areas? We've evaluated based on all four of those. The most important are the first two. So what we did here is we've taken that map that we looked at before, and we've put in gray the areas that are scoring lowest, and left in red the areas that are scoring highest. So an area like Area 20 or Area 18, those are both not contiguous with the existing urban growth boundary. So they're kind of far away. So you'd have to cherry stem it out to them in some way. That score is very low. Areas 11 and 12, for instance, are highly constrained. And they're at the end of this area that I think of as the amoeba, but it's perhaps more like a foot. Where it's already very expensive to get services, prohibitively expensive to get services down there. Areas 14, 15, and 16 are highly constrained. Area 17 is constrained, and it's next to, what is the name of that park? I always forget.
Vista Park. It's sort of an unofficial park.
Okay. And so that leaves areas 1, 2, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, 13, 19, and 21 for under consideration. And those areas, when you add up all their acres, are, I think there's something like 525 acres or something like that. So a little more than we need in terms of unconstrained land. And we know that some parts of the areas, like when we talk about Area 21, the top part of this is pretty far away from the city. It's probably not a great area to consider bringing in. Parts of 19, some bits of it are probably a good idea, but some of it's constrained. So we're going to have to be sorting through some of these areas and figuring out what parts of the tax lots we're looking at, or what tax lots we're looking at and which tax lots we're not looking at. And we're going to embark on some of that work in the next month with staff on doing that. Yes.
So if I understand you correctly, basically the red highlighted areas is where we're going to pull our land from.
That's the areas under
And then
consideration.
And then you're probably going to pull out about 50 acres or something out of that, take the best of that. Is that more or less?
Of the 525, we're looking for 419
Okay, so
or so,
130 acres will go bye-bye.
something like that. Yeah.
Then that'll be the final map at some point.
Yes.
Okay.
And what will happen is, as we look at some of these areas, you're going to bring in some constrained areas because some parts of tax lots, I'll show you one or two, are obvious tax lots to be brought in, and bits of them are constrained. So your eventual expansion will be somewhere more than 419 acres, but it'll be 419 or so buildable acres. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You take main roads and things like that out of your gross and net numbers, or?
We did that already in our
Okay,
analysis.
so that's already been done. Okay.
So, yeah. Yeah, we would call it 419 gross acres, so accounting for land for roads.
Okay.
Are there any other questions before I go on to talk about some of the specifics of the areas? Okay. Yes, ma'am. There's no priority implied.
Can you bring the mic?
Sorry, I turned it around. That was Edie. Just the idea of, what does number 4, how is,
Let's talk about that in a few moments.
okay.
Is that okay?
Thank you, yeah.
And perhaps Nicole can bring up the table where I can look at how many acres are in the different areas. She knew I want that. So the areas identified in gray are a poor fit for efficiently meeting the residential and commercial land needs. They have higher costs for extending public facilities or utilities, considering the distance from the city, et cetera, et cetera. So that's why those areas are lower priority. So sub area 1, I'm just going to go 1 through 21 because that's in order to go. Sub area 1 and sub area 2. Sub area 1's along Highway 30. It has about how many acres in it? I'm going to ask you this over and over. I apologize. Yep, sub area 1.
9 total acres.
So 28 unconstrained acres. You can see that there's little bits on this tax lot and this tax lot that are constrained. So sub area 1 is got a medium and high cost for infrastructure. We're thinking that it'll probably be in the urban reserve area because of infrastructure costs. And thought of, the fact that that would be ready for development a little bit later. We're thinking about it as a commercial land need. And of course, in the urban reserve area, we'll probably note it in the findings as commercial land need so that people can find that later in 10 or 20 years when they're looking at an expansion. But it will just be urban reserve. Sub area 2, it's adjacent to the airport. It's currently zoned for what do you call it? Resource industrial plan development. It would probably be brought in looking at commercial land needs. Its infrastructure costs are low to medium. Of course, some things, like roads might be low and I don't know, wastewater might be medium. And that's why we've got the range. And so we're looking at that for possible UGB inclusion for commercial uses. It does have a fair bit of constraints on it right now. We won't be getting rid of the constraints, so it's constrained. And it's got 11 unconstrained acres on it, so it's not a big area.
And Pat, we've got Paul online.
Paul.
Quick question. I didn't see any industrial inclusions, just commercial, but we should not confuse commercial with industrial for the purposes of this discussion, correct?
Correct. There is no land need that was identified for industrial. So if this was brought into the UGB, eventually it would be planned commercial and eventually be zoned commercial.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
So, pardon me, question. So we did all our calculations on how much industrial and commercial we need, but it looks, we're gonna put a designation of this as commercial, but it's currently industrial. Wouldn't that adjust
It's
our?
in the county as industrial.
So we
It's
did not include
outside
it.
the urban
So
growth.
we did not include it in any of our previous calculations.
No, we did not.
Beth, what's the acreage of that, of the,
It's about 11 acres of unconstrained land.
It's okay with this?
I'm sorry?
That's Dave Maloney's land, isn't it?
No.
Oh, it's not. This is a-
Dave's in the UGB. This is north of, this is where the barn,
Oh, the bed and breakfast.
Barnstormer?
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay. Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to go on to sub-area 4, asking that question. So it's got few constraints. It's near existing neighborhoods. The inclusion would fix an existing septic system issue for the existing mobile home park that's there. The infrastructure costs would be low to medium, so we're looking at it for residential for UGB. The existing mobile home park, which I assume would stay, we would not be planning on the mobile home park leaving, covers about a quarter of the site. It's sort of in this kind of area. So that would allow for other housing developments in the area that's not the mobile home parks. We would only be counting the area that was not developed, so the area not in the mobile home parks, as however many acres would come in for that. And I don't know if we've got that math right here. 18 unconstrained acres. And how many acres is not developed? You may not be able to answer that quickly. Okay. Okay, that's just more complicated to subtract out the mobile home park. So this fixes an existing problem where the mobile home park has some existing septic issues. So they would, if they were in the UGB, they would be able to connect with the city's sanitary sewer, and it allows for some other housing development in the areas right around it. Felt like you wanted to say something.
No, just that we've been in contact with the mobile home park owner for the last few years and they need a solution. So, it makes sense to bring in this area here. They're abutting city limits, so they could immediately apply for annexation once they were brought into the UGB.
And remember that any land that's brought into the UGB, it can't annex until it's abutting city limits, and it doesn't annex until the owner requests annexation. So there's not a forced annexation essentially. And your existing zoning stays the same until you annex, and your property taxes stay the same until you annex.
So you've been in conversations with the owner of
Could you speak into the thing a little more?
You've been in conversations with the mobile owner. Is there anything currently that, discussions that, for example, when it does come into the city, regulations, things that they would need to upgrade, change? Anything that you had discussions with the owner that,
Do you mean in terms of the houses themselves?
right?
No,
for
it's
the-
really the conversations have centered around when can we be served with public sewer? Yeah.
That take into place into when we decide to build around it?
It would not take place unless this were brought into the UGB and they applied for annexation. Yeah, yep,
So it couldn't be annexed currently.
that's correct,
And it can't be served currently
correct.
without a Goal 11 exception.
is this going to be part of our urban reserve or part of our UGB?
We would look to bring this in as part of the UGB so that they could, because it's like, obviously you can see it's adjacent to current city limits.
It makes sense.
And it's relatively, its infrastructure costs are on the lower side.
Makes sense.
And would we then annex the entire area or just the?
Oh, each property owner can elect to annex whenever they're ready and want to. They don't have to.
I was looking at the satellite map. It's like farm and then the mobile home park and a
Mhm.
couple houses.
Mhm.
Yep.
Mhm. Yeah, they don't have to. Yeah, it's totally up to each individual owner.
Okay, I'm gonna take us on. These are good questions. So this is a complex subarea. I really like this one. Subarea 5, 6, and on the next page is 7. These are all right adjacent to Highway 30. So subarea 5, it includes a little bit of land on the other side of Highway 30 on the east side. And it's got a little arm that goes up. And it's hard to even see on the maps and it's hard to show on maps, but it includes that. And so those areas are zoned things like existing commercial, plan development, I guess resource industrial plan development, that kind of thing. And then there's a lot of RR5 in this area. This area is pretty far south, so it's at the southern end of the existing urban growth boundary. It's got few constraints. The cost of infrastructure is medium to high. The possible land needs that it would meet are commercial and residential for urban reserves, because there's areas north of it in area 7 and 8 that are more likely to be more serviceable now, and better candidates for bringing into the UGB early. So area 6 is a really interesting one. The western portion of it is highly constrained, and it's also existing parcelized. The infrastructure in area 6 costs would be medium. We're not sure if we're thinking about this for urban growth boundary or urban reserves, but if you have area 5 in and you have area 7 in, parts of area 6, I think, would be important for connectivity. So you don't have a weird set of jogs at the bottom of your UGB. So I'm imagining that a portion of sub area 6 would come in. And while we have to draw these sub areas so that they're no bigger than 100 acres, that's why there's so many of them and they're so funny shaped. They're also funny. Once you have this land in the UGB, you don't have this artificial look at these sub areas over top of them. So you have to think about, the connectivity among these different areas, and what's going to make sense in your, 15 to 20 years, or 30 years as things, get brought into the city and get developed over time.
Looks like
Christine, I saw you had a question. Then Kim. Go ahead, Christine.
My question was where's the county line right there? And can we cross over that? I don't know if you have, but would you cross over it?
No, we don't want to go to Multnomah County. Nobody wants to be in Multnomah
Oh, I
County.
know, I agree. We definitely don't like Multnomah County.
I think
I
it's
mean,
the
we don't
dotted-
want to go over
Yeah,
there.
It's that dotted line
Yep.
here.
It's still pretty far north.
Oh, okay, down there. Thank you.
We're perilously close, but we're not in Multnomah County.
Thank you.
And then Kim.
Yeah, so in area 6, where we've got it already parcelized and partially developed. So if we've got partially developed land, Lori, we can't get any SDCs then to support the infrastructure development, right? So is that what makes the cost of infrastructure a little higher, or how is that handled?
Well, it's not so much that per se. Like in Area 6, I think we had a cost of infrastructure medium. They do have their own private water system there. And then they also have roads already developed there. So, we wouldn't be collecting, you're right, we wouldn't be collecting SDCs for anything unless it was the result of new construction. And as Beth mentioned, there's not a whole lot of developable land in Section 6 that's more to the north or northeast, where we'd want that connection between 5 and 7. But again, it would still make sense to bring a portion in just so we have that connectivity.
And, maybe the portion that comes in ends up being along Bonneville Drive. And a piece of this sort of area that I'm pointing to. And it's really about connectivity down between areas 7 and 5. And then maybe this little portion of area 6 over here, maybe it's decided that that's a good area to bring in, and Kim realized that I don't know this area, that I'll be, we'll be relying very much on Lori and NJ and people like Chris to determine how we're breaking this sub area apart. So I wouldn't imagine the entire thing would come in, but a portion of it may make a lot of sense.
Okay, and then on the parcelized, where it does look already kind of pretty broken up there in section 6, each individual landowner would have a choice as to whether to join to annex in or not. So you could have pockets of non-annexation. How would that work?
Yes, you could. And so it has to be sequential too. So each property would need to be abutting current city limits. And so it would eventually kind of roll out. But you're right, if there's interceding property owners that don't choose to annex in, then you couldn't, it would preclude others from annexing in until they were adjacent. But we have that situation now. That's not new.
Okay.
And what I would say is, I think this is an area 6 especially, that we're going to have to look at very carefully, and decide very judiciously which parts necessary, essentially, connectivity.
Jeanette.
I was just gonna ask, because you said, have you haven't visited the sites yet, and do you plan to?
I probably won't necessarily visit the sites. I'm depending on staff to know the areas, and there's so many sites.
Giving the fine,
No, I think
like,
I'm
to staff, or staff is?
I'm helping staff understand the rules. But no, we're not giving the final recommendation. I mean, this may be something that's surprising to Lori, but I think staff have to know the area much better than we could ever possibly know it. So, and your public works staff understands the existing infrastructure and the challenges to getting infrastructure there in a way that I'm a planner. I'm not an engineer. So this is the kind of thing that you'd really, I really have to do in consort with staff, where I'm warning them of issues as it relates to rules and that kind of thing. But staff are in charge really of making those kind of recommendations, I think, for the community. So it's a think aloud together conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Lauren?
I was just going to mention, I know that area really well. A lot of it's very steep, but there's also many owners own 5, 10, 20, 30 lots.
Yeah.
So you see all these little lines and you're thinking, oh my God, we've got hundreds and hundreds of owners. It's not actually quite as bad as it looks, because there are owners that own 10, 20, 30 lots apiece.
And we wouldn't be looking to bring those real small lots in. Do you see a lot of it's constrained anyway?
yeah.
So we definitely would not be looking at that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's just more like around the edges.
More like the east edge of section of 6, sub area 6.
Okay.
Yeah. And I don't know about this little piece down here. It's on paper it looks interesting, but Jeanette, that takes me to, is it actually interesting? And staff have to weigh in on that.
And that's that's when we work together really with Beth and then our team at the city and Chris, and sit and look at the GIS and turn on the layers and look at everything. Look at the contours, does it make sense? Where are the existing houses on these parcels? Things like that.
Christine, did you have a question?
My question was, has staff visited these spots in person as of yet?
No, Christine, we're looking at this from a pretty high level. And so we're looking at it with our GIS at aerial views, looking at, the constraints, any existing utilities in the area. So the analysis really is from an aerial viewpoint.
And I would imagine that, as we're having these discussions in areas like this that are problematic, it may make sense to do a field trip.
Yeah. And I think once we get down to that granular level, it may well come down to, we need to be out in the field taking a look.
And that makes sense. But first we have to get it down to closer to granular. So we're looking at just somewhat smaller areas of land.
Mhm.
So
Right now, it's the sky view.
Yeah.
we're looking at the sky view.
We're not, we haven't found it yet.
Yeah, we're gonna get there. That's part of the reason that some of this takes so long. And area 7 is constrained in some portions. It's adjacent to your commercial and your residential areas. Its cost of infrastructure is medium. We're thinking that this area is probably some commercial and probably some residential for UGB expansion. So this is an example of, this parcel. I know nothing about who owns these parcels, so I've got no bias in that way because I can't. But this parcel right here, it's got some constraints on it. Does it make sense to include it? This parcel right here has some constraints on it, and it might well be very important for including for connection with Area 5. But it may well never necessarily build out all that much with that constraint. So there's going to be some considerations of that kind of thing, what some of the trade-offs are of where you draw those lines.
I know some of the owners on 7.
Mhm.
And I think if you try to do commercial over there, you're going to get a pushback. I think you're better with residential over there.
Mhm.
I think some of those people are not going to want to go to rebuild or redevelop, and
Might make sense, yeah.
and they'll be much more upset with commercial than
Mhm.
they will be with housing.
Well, the idea is not to upset people.
Yeah.
And the immediate commercial needs aren't large.
Yeah.
So I would, my suggestion would be 7 should be more housing, or maybe even like high density along Old Portland Road if you want to do something higher than just regular single family homes. But I would
Yeah,
not start putting commercial in there.
We have, yeah, I hear what you're saying. Yeah. We do have a surplus of the low density designation. So
That
we
would be medium.
we'd look to do, yeah, medium for middle
I
housing
think that would
and,
be fine, but I think if you went commercial, you might be stirring a hornet's nest there.
We don't want to stir hornets. So, thank you. I'm going to hop on to area 8. Subarea 8 has few constraints. It's adjacent to existing residential neighborhoods. Its cost of infrastructure is low to medium. We're thinking residential, probably for UGB, because it's an area that's more developable than others. Subarea 9, we're not looking at very hard. It's in the gray in the other maps, and a part of subarea 10 we're looking at more seriously. Obviously, parts of it are very constrained, and we're looking at those parts less. One of my questions I've had in this is, if you get some more of the infrastructure in subarea 8 and subarea 10, can you help make it so that it's more plausible to do some of that infrastructure out in your amoeba part? And that will also figure into subarea 13. Again, I'm not the engineer, so I may be wrong about that. But that's what we're looking at in subarea 10. I think we're talking about subarea 10 probably for urban reserves rather than UGB. Subarea 13, we're looking at, it's got few constraints. It's actually got some somewhat larger parcels. The cost of infrastructure is medium. We think it's probably residential urban reserves. How much of subarea 13 and how much it might go off Mountain View Drive or up to Baker View Drive, we haven't had those discussions. That's part of where we're going to next. But subarea 13 is a good example of where you've got some scattered constraints, but you certainly still have some areas that are very buildable. Subarea 14, we've pretty much ruled out as it's highly constrained. But again, depending on what we're looking at in tax lots, which are really hard to see on these maps, there may be a little portion of subarea 14 that we should be looking at more strongly. And we can cross over these subareas if we need to. So sub area 19, we're not looking at 18 or 17 or 20. 20 is not adjacent to the urban growth boundary. 18 is not adjacent and 17 is constrained and in an area that's, it's adjacent to an area that's never really going to develop as a residential area, to my knowledge at least. So parts of sub area 19 up Bellcrest Road may be pretty interesting for consideration. And that's why we've got this sub area in. Again, it's one that constraints are sort of fingered through. And we're thinking urban reserves. In sub area 21, this is our only sub area that has any land that is in farm or forest agriculture. So it's in resource zoning. It's the part in brown. It's got a little bit of it. It's not a lot of it. Sub-area 21 is an interesting sub-area because some parts really are adjacent to the UGB, but they're not adjacent to areas that you have existing development in all that much. So we're thinking about this in the longer term. The costs for infrastructure are higher, and it's, probably urban reserves. So I think there are certainly parts of sub-area 21 that we're not really thinking seriously about, like this area back up here, that would be just a weird thing sticking out of the city, bad urban form. And I think that is what we're thinking about right now. Our next step is to identify the specific areas to include in the UGB and in urban reserves. Here I've given you an example of sub-area 6, where the city may look at bringing in that chunk of sub-area 6 that we've got highlighted. That was just a good example of an area that is difficult and bears some thinking on and thinking about how that would fit with the rest of the city if sub-area 7 and 5 eventually come in.
How do you identify that chunks of, the chunks of sub areas? How do you guys identify it? Is just something that you
Like this chunk that, might be appropriate while the rest of sub-area 6 isn't?
How do you guys identify chunk 5, 6, 7? And so now that you're trying to identify thing between 5 and 6, how do you, first of all, my first question would be, how do you guys identify each chunk?
Okay, how are each sub-area determined?
Right, exactly.
So we sat down and tried to draw sub-areas in ways that made sense so that like sub-area 12 or 11, those are areas that we knew we'd have to consider. I'm going back to this map. We knew we'd have to consider, and we knew that they weren't going to be great because of their location and because of how constrained they were. So we tried to draw them. They can't be more than 100 acres each. That's state rule. So we tried to draw them in ways that made sense. So like it was clear that, sub area, 8, 7, 6, and 5 were really interesting sub areas, and we needed to divide them somewhat. Okay. And so exactly how we came upon those, we talked about different configurations with the city and what might make sense for looking at urban reserves and that kind of thing. We wanted to make sure that we weren't drawing sub areas in a stupid way. I'll just use that term, like, rectangles that, weren't necessarily connected with each other in any way. We tried to follow property lines, tax lot lines. So that, we don't want to break apart tax lots. That's no good. We looked at all the areas where you could see even a modicum of land that was in exception zones that was unconstrained. So like sub-area 11 or sub-area 16 or 14, they don't have a lot of land that is unconstrained, but in exceptions areas, but they got some. Sub-area 21, I'm going to flip up to this map. It's a good example. It's the only area that we included some high-value land in, high-value farm and forest land in. Because if we didn't, then that would, really violate tax lot boundaries and be a very awkward shape to consider, bringing any of that into the urban reserves or UGB. So we were trying to, go with areas that were less constrained, areas that we could reasonably evaluate among, each other, looking at different infrastructure costs and things that for planners and engineers made some sense in the context of our Oregon systems, in the context of what we have to do. Does that help answer any of the
Yeah,
questions?
So it just gave me kind of, so when you're trying to say you're going to bring it into the, this little section between 6 and
Yeah.
5, want to bring it in as a UGB or urban reserve? That, I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
I'm not sure what we'd be doing there. We haven't really talked about that. I imagine that might well be urban reserves. Like if Area 5 was brought in mostly as urban reserves or entirely as urban reserves, then it would probably make sense to bring in that piece of Area 6 along with it as urban reserves. But we haven't talked about that.
That piece of 6 is mostly built out.
Yeah.
Yeah, but the houses there are on fairly large lots. So that would be an infill opportunity in theory.
Potentially, depending on where they are on the lot.
And that area at the bottom of right where the arrow is pointed in Area 6, that's not built out.
Right.
So, as Area 5 builds out, maybe that, piece also builds out. Because of course, as soon as you've established urban reserves or expanded your UGB, these sub areas, they just disappear and it becomes, part of the urban reserve. Should we consider this part over here or this part over here? So these sub areas are just good for doing some of the evaluation of the type we were just describing. I think they're really artificial, but required. It's really hard to get your mind around this. We're planning on sitting down with maps and drawing some lines and thinking about it and talking about it. And then I imagine that staff is going to go look at it more and do some more thinking and talking and make sure that we're coming out to the right magical numbers. Approximately 419 acres in, UGB and urban reserves. Not counting constrained acres that we have to bring in anyway. So.
I think it'd be a good idea for staff to go out and look at these sites. Really good idea to see how realistic they are to develop in the future.
We're definitely better than others.
I mean, the problem is that none of these are, some of them are really good, but none of these are perfect.
Just the infill idea of a lot right now that's an acre with a house, and is it?
I wouldn't necessarily count that as additional capacity. We're only counting portions of that kind of thing as additional capacity. So
if there was a house on an acre and you brought it in, you wouldn't have to count it as an acre. You could count it as a part of that acre. Is that correct?
We are considering that if it was on an acre, that a portion of that, like maybe a quarter acre on average, would be available.
Okay.
And so it's a little, it's recognizing that some of these existing parcels may subdivide. We don't know which ones. We don't know how much. We're giving some reasonable estimate.
Yeah, guesstimate. Okay.
Christine, did you have a question?
I just wanted to concur with you that I think that the importance of staff visiting these spaces, like especially, I think it's like wherever Bonneville Estates are, those are huge lots with huge houses. I can't imagine that they're going to give up their space. And a lot of these people, have 2 and 3 acres that they seem pretty happy with 2 and 3 acres. So how do you convince them?
They don't, yeah, this would go, especially in an area out out that far would be, or in Bonneville, were you saying, Christine?
Yes,
5,
yes.
6.
And so, that likely would be designated for urban reserves. So that's really looking out, the 20 to 50-year range. So certainly not, we wouldn't expect redevelopment, in the short term. But given pressures and, the city kind of naturally expanding to the south that way in the future, it could be conceivable that they would look to subdivide.
And we would be accounting a portion of those partially developed areas, not all of those areas as part of the capacity. So it would be a portion of it.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Jeff?
So are we constrained then by state law from expanding actually all the way south to the county line?
No, but I can't imagine the complexity that brings to the city if the city expanded into Multnomah County.
I don't mean I
This
mean
means to the line.
to the line.
Oh, the line is a little more than half a mile away, and that's why we haven't looked further than that. I mean, we could if that's a exceptions area that far, but I don't know how close the city wants to come to the county line. I'm not sure that there's a reason to go quite that far either.
Well, I think in terms of extending utilities too, the further you go, the more it costs. So trying to look at what's closer in probably makes more sense for us in the shorter term.
This is the presentation we had for you. So
So is that line at the bottom of this map below 5, is that the county line?
that is the county line.
Dashed line.
Yeah.
Dash line right there. That's the county line.
There's only like 4 or 5 lots.
There is only 4 or 5 lots.
That area is kind of gently sloping upwards, some of it, and others it has a steep hill behind it. Anyhow, okay.
Watson Road there.
Yeah, it's roughly, yeah.
Pine Canal.
Like we would grow closer. Basically, but
Well, I mean, overall, we're talking about a half mile down towards the county overall.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
are there other comments or questions?
So we don't have a plan currently to have anything large like Home Depot or anything like that, and we're just not going to do it as part of this. Is that correct?
No, we're not looking at like bringing in a particular
I'm saying larger parcels. There's no large parcel component of this that we could set
Our
aside.
need for commercial was not that high.
I know, but I was thinking not general commercial, but specifically large parcel commercial. 'Cause we don't have a lot of that.
That's a harder case to make.
Oh, okay.
So and I'd have to dig way back into your economic opportunities analysis.
In other words, it doesn't follow the same kind of review as like a large industrial parcel would in terms of UGB findings and things.
It's harder. It's a harder case to make.
Is there any way in the future, let's say somebody wanted to do something like that here, that they would be able to get the land, or are they just out of luck?
I think they would need to look at parcel assembly. And that's probably the way to do it. I mean, if you had a 2-acre parcel, or if you're redeveloping some of the strip development along Highway 30, you may be able to do that.
Assemble it.
Um,
Okay.
So
But we're not gonna just a 10-acre parcel or something. Okay.
So next steps.
next steps, let's go on to that.
well, I think on this, in general, I like how we're developing west of Highway 30 with more residential,
Mm-hmm.
and of course, there's a couple parcels east, but just because of the floodplain and the dike district and the issues we're having there, I think it does make sense to expand west of Highway 30, and that's what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
I think some of the uh, farmland west of Highway 30 is not high valued farmland. The farmland east of Highway 30 is.
Yeah, you've got some lower value farmland to the west of Highway
West,
30.
Yeah.
It's also really connected into some areas that just aren't great for future growth. If you look at, the area next to 17, you can see that area is constrained. This area beyond 16, that area is constrained, and it's also, adjacent to this area that is just not going to develop in the same way and connect in the same way
Mhm.
with the city.
I think you're right. It's for the further up the hill you get, the harder it's going to be with infrastructure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I do like the idea of being west of Highway 30 and connecting with that.
Mhm.
I mean, honestly, your really interesting areas in the short term are area 2, 4, 8, possibly parts of 7. So those are, and I'm super curious about what 13 and 10 might well do and make possible, because there's more area for development along that foot. I have hopes that it'll make it more financially feasible. I'm not at all sure that I'm right.
Any other comments before we do next steps? Go ahead, Beth.
All right, next steps. We're going to sit down and talk about this a lot with staff. I imagine staff are going to go and have some closer looks and make sure that the areas that we're drawing on the map make sense. And that'll let us finalize the UGB and urban reserves analysis. We're going to develop that 50-year plan document. I'm hoping it's going to be something fewer than 20 pages that tells the story, and that normal human beings, if they're curious, could pick it up and understand. Normal human beings not necessarily being planners or, development geeks or anything like that. And then we've got presentation and discussion with city council, and then hearings that are likely to start in the fall. So I imagine we'll be coming back to you for the last meeting somewhere in, I'm going to guess August. We'll need some time in July to get the 50-year plan together and get it in nice layout and that kind of thing so that we can bring it to you. And that's all.
So the order would be.
Thank you,
last
Beth.
Meeting here, then council.
I imagine we'll have some council meetings before that, but last meeting here, and then hearings with the council and work sessions with the county, and then eventually hearings with the county. So we've got a county, I should have listed it on here. We've got a city council meeting coming up in early May, where I think we're still talking some about some of the code changes, and we're introducing them to what we're doing here. So updating council on all of that. It all gets adopted all together.
Ari, anything else to add?
That's all. I just want to thank everyone who has been involved with this committee. It's been 3 years, and I really appreciate everyone's time and effort in reviewing all the documents that we brought to you. So thank you.
I'll double click that. Thank you,
And I'll say that
Brian, Jeff.
your comments are really helpful.
A learning experience. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Paula, did you want to say something? For some reason, we're zoomed in on you.
You're really big on the screen right now.
Okay, thank
Well,
you,
could we go
everyone.
back? Could we go back through the slides again?
Okay, good night, Paul.
He just disconnected you.
All right, thank you. We'll adjourn the meeting.
Thank you, everyone.
You guys know that Paul was joking. I'm like, oh no, can I get the slides back up again?